There's something I keep coming back to when I watch the news coverage of this war. The cameras focus on the explosions, the press briefings, the diplomatic statements, the body counts, and all of that is real. All of that matters on a human level, but none of it tells you where things are actually going. To understand where things are going, you have to look underneath the surface. You have to look at the bones of the situation, the structural forces, the real incentives, the historical patterns that don't show up in headlines, but that quietly determine how every major conflict in human history has ultimately resolved itself. That is what I want to do today. I want to go deep. I want to be honest about what I think is happening and where I think it ends. And I want to show you the reasoning step by step because I have never believed in just telling people what to think. I believe in showing the work. Before I get into the prediction itself, I want to spend some time on context because the prediction I'm going to make today doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is the continuation of a line of reasoning that began some time ago when three specific predictions were made that most informed, serious, well credentialed observers considered somewhere between unlikely and absurd. The first prediction was that Donald Trump would return to the White House. At the time, he was facing nearly 100 criminal charges across multiple jurisdictions. The mainstream consensus was that his political career was effectively over. The second prediction was that the United States would go to war with Iran. Not a proxy conflict, not a skirmish, but a real, direct military confrontation between the two countries. The third prediction was the most sweeping and the most uncomfortable, that the United States would lose this war and that this loss would mark a turning point in the structure of global power, as significant as anything that has happened since the end of the Cold War. Two of those three predictions have now materialized. Trump won. The war with Iran is real and ongoing, and the entire world is now watching, some with anxiety, some with hope, some with grim satisfaction, to see whether the third prediction proves correct as well. I'm not telling you this to congratulate myself. I'm telling you this because I think it matters enormously that these predictions weren't guesses. They weren't contrarian bets made for the sake of being different. They were conclusions drawn from a specific analytical method, one that combines structural analysis, game theory, and the study of historical patterns across centuries. And today, I want to use that same method to answer the question that I think is now the most important question in international affairs. How does this war actually end? Let me start with the method itself, because I think understanding the method is just as important as understanding the conclusion. When I try to predict how a major geopolitical situation will unfold, I focus on three things. The first is structure. By structure, I mean the deep, slow-moving forces that constrain what is possible. Geography, demographics, economic systems, military capabilities, the physical layout of trade routes, and energy infrastructure. These things don't change quickly. They don't respond to speeches or diplomatic gestures. They set the boundaries within which all the human drama plays out. The second thing I focus on is incentives. Every player in any geopolitical situation is trying to maximize something: security, wealth, political survival, ideological goals, legacy. And critically, what players say they want in public and what they actually want in private are almost never identical. In fact, the gap between the stated goal and the real goal is often the most revealing thing you can study about any conflict. The third thing I focus on is historical pattern recognition. Not because history repeats itself in a mechanical way, it doesn't, but because human beings are human beings, empires are empires, and certain dynamics appear again and again across thousands of years of recorded history with remarkable consistency. If you've studied enough history carefully enough, you start to recognize the shape of situations, even when the specific details are new. With that framework in mind, let me now walk through this conflict systematically. Let me start with the players and their real interests, because this is the foundation everything else rests on. What does America say it wants? The public answer is well known. America says it wants to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It says it wants to support democracy and human rights in Iran. It says it wants peace, stability, and a rules-based international order in the Middle East. These are the official positions. These are what gets said in congressional hearings and presidential addresses and State Department press releases. And some of the people saying these things probably believe them sincerely. But what does America actually want? Structurally, institutionally, at the level of its core national interest? The honest answer, when you follow the logic carefully, comes down to one thing: the preservation of the petrodollar system. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented, discussed openly in academic literature, and acknowledged by serious economists and foreign policy analysts across the political spectrum. Since the early 1970s, a quiet but world-shaping arrangement has been in place. Global oil is priced and traded in US dollars. This single fact creates permanent structural global demand for American currency. Every country that needs to buy oil, which is essentially every country on Earth, needs to hold US dollars to do so. This gives America an extraordinary privilege that no other nation in history has ever possessed: the ability to print its own currency, run massive deficits, and finance its government at relatively low cost because there will always be buyers for American debt and American dollars. Without the petrodollar, the arithmetic of American power changes completely. The military budget that currently funds hundreds of overseas bases, 11 aircraft carrier groups, and the most technologically advanced armed forces in human history, that budget becomes far harder to sustain. And without that military reach, America cannot enforce the kind of global economic order from which it benefits so disproportionately. So, when you strip away the rhetoric and look at the structural logic, what this war is really about is the defense of an economic architecture that has underpinned American dominance for half a century. The Middle East is the geographic heart of global oil production. Whoever controls the Middle East, or more precisely, whoever controls the flow of oil out of the Middle East, holds enormous leverage over the global economy. America has understood this since the 1940s. Maintaining that control, by whatever means necessary, is the actual core objective. Everything else is secondary. Now, what does Iran want? At the most fundamental level, Iran wants to survive. This sounds simple, but I don't think most Western audiences fully appreciate just how existential this conflict feels from the Iranian perspective. Iran has been under comprehensive American economic sanctions for decades. It has watched the United States overthrow or destabilize governments in neighboring countries with which it shares culture, history, and borders. It watched Iraq, which was once the most powerful Arab military state, get invaded and dismantled. It watched Libya, which had a functional government and a relatively prosperous economy, get destroyed by a NATO intervention that was sold to the world as a humanitarian mission. It watched Syria spend years in a catastrophic civil war, fed in part by outside powers. Iran's leadership has drawn a very clear lesson from all of this. Governments that show weakness or that make themselves dependent on American goodwill do not survive. The only protection is strength, deterrence, and the demonstrated willingness to inflict real costs on anyone who tries to destroy you. Beyond survival, though, Iran has more specific and in some ways more ambitious goals. It wants permanent, legally binding relief from sanctions, not a temporary waiver, not a conditional suspension, but a genuine end to the economic isolation that has stunted its development for a generation. It wants recognition as a legitimate regional power with a sphere of influence that includes Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen through its network of allied movements. It wants control over the Strait of Hormuz not just as a wartime tactic, but as a permanent structural feature of its geopolitical position. A choke point it can use as leverage in any future negotiation, and it wants guarantees that its allied movements, the groups it has invested in and supported for decades, will be recognized as legitimate political actors rather than simply designated as terrorist organizations to be eliminated whenever it suits Washington's purposes. These are not irrational demands. You might disagree with the Iranian government on many things. I certainly have significant reservations about its domestic record. But from a pure game theory perspective, these are the logical goals of a state that has spent decades under siege and is now fighting for a fundamentally different relationship with the international order. Israel's position deserves careful analysis because I think it is consistently misread in mainstream Western commentary. The dominant narrative presents Israel as a reactive actor, a country defending itself, responding to threats, trying to maintain its security in a hostile neighborhood. There is truth in that narrative, but I think there is a deeper strategic logic at work that is worth making explicit. Israel finds itself in a genuinely unusual historical moment. American power in the Middle East is visibly declining. The credibility and staying power of American security guarantees are being questioned by every government in the region. And into that vacuum, Israel is positioning itself not merely as a country that wants to survive, but as the candidate to replace America as the region's organizing power, the entity that provides security, intelligence, and strategic coherence to the global financial interests that have historically benefited from Middle Eastern stability. Israel is, in effect, demonstrating its value proposition to the international elite, its military sophistication, its intelligence capabilities, its social cohesion under pressure, and its willingness to use force decisively. Whether this bet ultimately succeeds is one of the most consequential open questions of the coming decade. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, are the most vulnerable players in this situation, and in some ways the most fascinating to watch. These are extraordinarily wealthy countries with modern infrastructure and considerable diplomatic influence, but they are militarily weak in a deep structural sense. Their populations are relatively small. Their armed forces, despite enormous defense spending, have not demonstrated the ability to fight and win serious conflicts on their own. Their entire security model for the past several decades has rested on American protection. Now that protection is visibly wavering and these governments are doing what politically rational actors in their position have always done throughout history, they are watching which way the wind is blowing, maintaining relationships on multiple sides, and preparing to align themselves with whoever emerges as the dominant power once the dust settles. They will not lead, they will follow, and they will follow strength. Now, let me turn to the structural realities because this is where the analysis becomes most rigorous and I think most clarifying. The most important structural fact about this war is one that the American military and the American media are both, for different reasons, reluctant to state plainly. Air power alone has never, in the entire history of modern warfare, been sufficient to force the collapse of a determined government with significant popular support. This is not a controversial claim among serious military historians. It is one of the most thoroughly documented findings in the academic literature on warfare. The United States dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than were dropped by all sides combined in the entirety of the Second World War. North Vietnam did not surrender. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces conducted a sustained, years-long campaign of strategic bombing against Germany that destroyed hundreds of cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Germany did not collapse from the air. It surrendered only when Soviet forces reached Berlin and American and British forces crossed the Rhine. The bombing accelerated the end. It did not cause it. This historical pattern matters enormously for understanding the current situation because it means that if America's actual objective is regime change in Iran, the replacement of the current government with one more amenable to American interests, then eventually, if that objective is to be pursued seriously, ground troops become necessary. There is no air power only path to regime change. The logic of the stated objective, if pursued to its conclusion, leads to a land invasion. And a land invasion of Iran is, by any serious military assessment, an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking. Consider the basic facts. Iran is a country of roughly 90 million people spread across a territory 4 times the size of Iraq. Its geography is dominated by mountain ranges, the Zagros in the west, the Alborz in the north, that create natural defensive advantages that have challenged invaders for thousands of years. The Iranian military has spent roughly a quarter century specifically systematically preparing for a potential American ground invasion. Not 2 years, not 5 years, 25 years of planning, preparation, and investment in exactly the kind of asymmetric capabilities that would make a conventional American ground campaign extraordinarily costly. Underground military facilities built deep into mountain rock, dispersed, decentralized drone and missile manufacturing spread across dozens of locations so that no single strike can meaningfully degrade production capacity. Anti-armor and anti-helicopter systems designed specifically for the kind of close-range mountain warfare that would characterize a ground campaign in western Iran. And beyond the purely military dimension, a population that, whatever its feelings about its own government, has a deep historical memory of foreign invasion and a demonstrated willingness to fight against occupiers. Beyond Iran's own territory, a ground invasion would create cascading risks across the entire region. America's military position in the Middle East depends on a network of bases and supply lines running through the Gulf states. If American troops are physically inside Iranian territory, what is to stop Iraqi militias aligned with Iran from moving against those supply lines? What is to stop Yemen from escalating its attacks on Saudi infrastructure to the point where Saudi Arabia's ability to function as a staging ground for American operations is seriously compromised? Suddenly, instead of fighting one country, America finds itself managing a multi-front crisis stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, with its supply lines under threat and its regional partners in varying degrees of panic. I am genuinely convinced that a full-scale ground invasion of Iran will not happen. Not because the impulse won't be there, it will be, especially as the air campaign fails to produce the decisive results that were promised. But because the people within the American national security apparatus who understand the military realities know that a land war in Iran, fought to a conclusion, would require a commitment of forces and resources that the American political system simply cannot sustain. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of troops. We are talking about years of combat. We are talking about casualty levels that would make Iraq look modest by comparison. We are talking, almost certainly, about the revival of military conscription, a draft that would tear American society apart in ways that would make the Vietnam era look manageable. Any president who ordered a full ground invasion of Iran and then watched it turn into a grinding, years-long catastrophe would not just lose the next election, they would likely destroy their party's political viability for a generation and accelerate every financial and social pressure that is already straining American institutions. So if a ground invasion is off the table and air power alone cannot achieve regime change, where does that leave the situation? It leaves it in the place that I think it was always structurally destined to arrive, a prolonged, expensive, politically corrosive stalemate that eventually forces an American withdrawal. Let me explain why the economic pressure alone makes this outcome nearly inevitable. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important geographic features on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through it every single day. Iran sits on the northern shore of that strait and has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to threaten shipping through it. Now, add to that the situation in the Red Sea, where Yemeni forces, supplied and supported by Iran, have been targeting commercial shipping in ways that have already forced major shipping companies to reroute cargo around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and enormous costs to global supply chains. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden together carry somewhere between 12 and 15% of global trade. When you combine the pressure on the Strait of Hormuz with the disruption in the Red Sea, you are looking at two of the world's most critical maritime choke points under simultaneous threat. The economic consequences of this are not abstract. Oil prices at sustained elevated levels act as a tax on every single person in every oil importing economy on Earth. They raise the cost of transportation, which raises the cost of everything that gets transported, which is essentially everything. They raise fertilizer costs, which raises food prices globally. They compress corporate margins, reduce consumer spending, and slow economic growth across the entire integrated global economy. A world in which oil trades at $150 or $200 per barrel for a sustained period is a world experiencing significant economic pain, and that pain falls disproportionately on ordinary working people who have the least buffer against rising costs. This creates a political dynamic inside America that no administration can manage indefinitely. When Americans fill their gas tanks and pay dramatically more than they were paying a year ago, they want to know why. When their grocery bills are substantially higher than they were, they want to know why. The answer to both questions leads back to this war. And that connection between the abstract foreign policy choices made in Washington and the concrete financial pain felt by ordinary families erodes political support for the conflict in a way that is deeply predictable and essentially irreversible. We have seen this dynamic play out in every major American military engagement of the past half century. It played out in Vietnam, it played out in Iraq, it played out in Afghanistan. Polling support for wars that produce economic pain and unclear progress drops, and once it drops past a certain threshold, the political space for sustaining the war simply closes. Iran has studied this dynamic with extraordinary care. Its entire strategic posture in this conflict is built around one fundamental insight. It does not need to defeat America militarily. It needs to outlast American political will. Every drone swarm that forces America to expend millions of dollars in interceptor missiles is not just a tactical event. It is a calculation about the long game. Every month of elevated oil prices is not just an economic consequence. It is pressure being applied to the soft tissue of American domestic politics. Iran is not trying to win a battle. It is trying to win a war of attrition against a political system that has a well-documented and historically consistent inability to sustain costly, open-ended military commitments. Given all of this, the structural military constraints, the economic pressures, the political dynamics, the historical patterns, here is what I believe happens. Within the next 1 to 2 years, the combination of rising costs, declining public support, and quiet pressure from the major powers that are not directly involved in this conflict, China, Russia, India, will create the conditions for an American exit. This exit will not be framed as a defeat. It will be framed very carefully as a strategic success, objectives achieved, capabilities degraded, a new phase of diplomacy beginning. The language will be designed to allow the administration to walk away without appearing to have lost, but the substance of it will be a fundamental retrenchment of American military presence in the Middle East, a withdrawal from the dominant position that America has held in the region since the 1970s. And this is where the most consequential chapter of the story begins, because when America pulls back, the region does not dissolve into chaos, or at least not permanently. Power abhors a vacuum. Two regional powers move to fill it. On one side, Iran, anchored by its deep strategic relationships with Russia and China, consolidated in its control of the eastern arc of the Middle East, permanently recognized as a major regional force with real leverage over global energy flows. On the other side, Israel, leveraging its extraordinary intelligence capabilities, its technological sophistication, and its dense web of relationships with global financial institutions, positioning itself as the dominant power in the western part of the region and the key node in the emerging trade corridors linking South Asia to Europe through the Gulf. The Gulf states split their alignments between these two poles, just as small and medium powers have always done when great power competition reshapes their neighborhood. Saudi Arabia tilts toward Israel while maintaining enough of a relationship with Iran to protect its oil infrastructure. Qatar and Oman, already more pragmatic in their diplomacy, move closer to Iran. The region settles, not into peace exactly, but into a new equilibrium, a multipolar Middle East organized around two strong regional powers with clearly understood spheres of influence. And here is the prediction that I think will surprise the most people. Iran and Israel, sworn ideological enemies today, will eventually arrive at a kind of cold coexistence. Not warmth, not normalization in any meaningful sense, but a mutual recognition of each other's strength and a pragmatic decision to direct their competitive energy toward the weaker parties in their respective spheres, rather than toward costly, open-ended direct conflict with each other. This is not unprecedented in history. The United States and the Soviet Union spent 4 decades in ferocious ideological competition, while simultaneously developing an elaborate set of tacit rules that kept them from destroying each other and the world. Enemies can coexist when they are strong enough and rational enough to understand the costs of the alternative. The deepest and most lasting consequence of all of this is what happens to the petrodollar. When America can no longer guarantee the security of Middle Eastern oil flows, when it has withdrawn its forces and accepted a diminished role in the region, the foundation of the arrangement that has sustained American financial dominance begins to erode seriously. This doesn't mean the immediate collapse of the US dollar or a sudden end to American economic power. Empires decline slowly. Monetary systems transition over decades, not overnight, but the trajectory changes. The long-term structural foundation of American financial privilege, the one that allows it to borrow cheaply, print freely, and run deficits that would destroy any other currency, that foundation begins to crack. And the cracks, once started, do not repair themselves. I think about the Athenian expedition to Sicily sometimes when I'm trying to find the right historical parallel for this moment. In 415 BC, Athens was at the height of its power. It was the dominant naval force in the Greek world. Its economy was strong. Its democracy, whatever its limitations, was the most sophisticated political system of its age, and it launched an enormous military expedition to conquer Sicily, a venture that its own most experienced military advisors warned was hubristic and dangerous. The expedition was a catastrophe of the first order. The entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or enslaved, and Athens, though it survived for some years afterward, never fully recovered its former position. The expedition had consumed resources, talent, and political cohesion that could not be replaced. Within a generation, Athenian hegemony in the Greek world was over. I am not predicting the collapse of the United States. America is an extraordinarily resilient society with enormous resources, deep institutional capacity, and a long history of recovering from strategic mistakes. What I am predicting is something more specific, a significant, durable diminishment of American global power, concentrated particularly in its ability to project military force into the Middle East and to maintain the financial architecture that has amplified its economic power for half a century. America survives this. But the America that emerges on the other side is a different country in the world, a powerful country still, but one among several powerful countries rather than the singular organizing force of the global system. This is a genuinely difficult thing for many Americans to process, and I say that without condescension. No country in history has easily accepted the end of its exceptional position. The British found it agonizing to accept the end of their empire after the Second World War. The Romans went through multiple cycles of denial before accepting that the empire had fundamentally changed. These transitions are always painful, always contested, always accompanied by political leaders who insist that the old order can be maintained if only the right policies are chosen, the right enemies defeated, the right alliances built. They almost always can't. What I believe, and what I want to be honest about as a belief rather than a certainty, is that the world that emerges from this period will be more structurally stable in the long run. Not because it will be more peaceful, it probably won't be, but because a genuinely multipolar world, in which several major powers balance against each other, is less catastrophically fragile than a unipolar world, in which everything depends on one empire making good decisions forever. Empires do not make good decisions forever. No institution built by human beings does. The question is always whether the transition from one order to another happens in a managed way or in a catastrophic one. And that question, how managed or catastrophic this particular transition turns out to be, is, I think, genuinely still open. It is the most important open question of our time. I could be wrong about pieces of this. I've tried to be transparent about where I'm reasoning from limited information and where the structural logic feels genuinely solid. If significant parts of this analysis turn out to be incorrect, I think that would be worth understanding carefully. Not to score points in either direction, but because understanding where predictive frameworks fail is just as important as understanding where they succeed. The goal is never to be right. The goal is to think as clearly as possible about genuinely difficult and consequential questions. Now I want to turn it over to you. Looking at this entire picture, the structural forces, the real interests of each player, the historical parallels, the economic pressures, what do you think is the single factor most likely to make this analysis wrong? Is there something being underestimated here? Something about American resilience or Iranian internal politics or the role of China that could change the trajectory? I'm genuinely curious what you see that might be missing.